The candlelight flickered across the polished floors of the Louisiana estate, casting long shadows that danced along the walls like restless spirits. The children of the Beauregard household laughed softly in the nursery, unaware of the silent observer in their midst. Amara, the young governess enslaved to the family, watched from the doorway, her hands folded neatly in front of her, eyes sharp and calculating. Years of oppression had honed her mind, patience, and precision. This is the story of how one enslaved woman transformed fear, darkness, and obedience into instruments of retribution, how she taught the children to fear the night, and how, years later, those lessons would lock the master himself into the very terror he had imposed upon others. Before we step deeper into this tale of patient, intelligent revenge, tell me, where are you watching from? What time is it there? Drop a comment, and if stories of cunning, calculated justice fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this story has been hidden in the shadows for generations. Amara had been born on the estate in 1815, her earliest memories a blur of cotton fields, strict discipline, and the towering presence of the master, Victor Beauregard. From childhood, she had learned that survival required more than obedience. It required intelligence, observation, and a careful cultivation of invisibility. To the master and his overseers, she appeared meek, compliant, and dutiful, a small, quiet shadow in the grand halls. Yet beneath that exterior, her mind catalogued every cruelty, every excess of punishment, every pattern of control that could be exploited in the future. The Beauregard children were both a burden and an opportunity. They were taught in the nursery, watched closely, and manipulated subtly in ways that seemed natural. Amara used this to her advantage, teaching obedience, proper manners, and a seemingly harmless respect for authority while carefully noting the predictable reactions of their father. She observed how he enforced discipline, how he overreacted to small infractions, and how his pride blinded him to the intelligence of those beneath him. Each day, she accumulated knowledge that would later transform fear into power. Amara's life was a study in restraint and patience. Beatings and public humiliation were daily occurrences, yet she learned to endure, to turn every lash into a lesson in observation. She memorized the patterns of the household, the schedule of the master, and the routine movements of the children. Every footstep in the hall, every lantern lit, and every door opened or closed was noted in her mind, catalogued, and rehearsed. This archive of detail became her secret weapon, a map of vulnerabilities that would one day become essential to her plan. The estate itself was a silent ally. Secret passages, narrow attics, and hidden rooms, all remnants of architectural idiosyncrasies, became elements in her mental blueprint. She visualized the house in meticulous detail, noting where shadows fell at different times of day, how the wind moved through open windows, and how sound traveled through floors and stairwells. The house, to Amara, was not merely a prison but a stage upon which precision, patience, and intelligence could turn oppression into inevitable retribution. Her interactions with other enslaved workers were measured and calculated. Some were cautious, some too fearful to risk complicity, but a few, subtle and observant like her, could be relied upon for silent cooperation. A glance, a pause, or a slight adjustment in routine became a language of quiet collaboration. These small gestures were invisible to the master, yet they reinforced her ability to control outcomes without exposure. Patience, not rashness, was her guiding principle. Each act, each observation, and each subtle engagement contributed to the eventual, meticulously orchestrated revenge. Amara's understanding of human psychology extended beyond her immediate captors. She learned how fear could be cultivated, how obedience could be guided, and how routine could become a tool of manipulation. Even small interactions with the master's children were rehearsals in control. Bedtime rituals, storytelling, whispered warnings in the dark. She trained the children subtly, teaching them to respect authority, to obey, but also to respond predictably to shadows, noises, and the dim light of night. Each lesson, seemingly innocent, was part of a much larger strategy that would culminate years later in precise, inescapable justice. The master, unaware of the depth of her intelligence, treated her as a shadow, a quiet servant too small to pose any real threat. His arrogance blinded him to the patient accumulation of knowledge, the careful observation of weaknesses, and the invisible network of allies that Amara had cultivated. Every outburst, every overreach, and every predictable reaction he displayed was logged in her mind, catalogued for future exploitation. She understood the value of time and observation, that vengeance delayed and prepared was far more potent than any impulsive act of resistance. Night fell across the estate, the shadows deepening and the corridors quieting. Amara stood by the nursery window, observing the lanterns in the hall, the patterns of movement in the main house, and the placement of the children in their beds. Every detail mattered. The position of doors, the timing of footsteps, the predictable lull of the master's nightly routine. Each evening, this silent vigilance reinforced her understanding of the estate's vulnerabilities. Every observation stored and catalogued as a piece of the larger, patient strategy she had been nurturing for years. Amara was no longer merely a child or a young servant. She had become an architect of inevitability, a silent strategist whose patience and intelligence transformed the household itself into an instrument of control. Every shadow, every creak in the floor, every predictable reaction of the master became part of the mental map she relied upon. The night of reckoning was distant but certain, and with each passing year, her preparation intensified. Patience, observation, and silent collaboration would ensure that the moment of retribution, when it arrived, would be precise, deliberate, and inevitable. By the end of the night, Amara returned to her quarters, the candlelight casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. She reflected on the day's observations, rehearsed sequences in her mind, and catalogued every subtle disruption, every predictable response, and every minor act of silent complicity among the household staff. The eventual moment of justice, when fear and darkness would become tools to overturn tyranny, was closer than ever. Years of oppression had honed her mind into a weapon more precise than any blade. Her patience, intelligence, and careful orchestration ensured that the day of reckoning would arrive not as chaos, but as inevitability. The following weeks were a study in subtlety, patience, and control. Amara moved quietly through the nursery and the children's rooms, her presence measured and deliberate, her every word carefully chosen. The children, Lydia, Charles, and young Emile, looked up to her with a mixture of curiosity and awe, unaware that their governess was teaching them more than letters and numbers. She was teaching them obedience, awareness, and, most importantly, the art of fear. Fear that would later serve as both shield and instrument in her carefully calculated plan of retribution. Bedtime rituals became a canvas for psychological conditioning. By the dim glow of a single candle, she would tell stories of spirits that prowled the dark corners of the estate, emphasizing caution, respect for boundaries, and the unknown lurking beyond sight. Shadows on the walls became ominous silhouettes, the rustle of leaves outside the window a harbinger of danger. Each tale, though seemingly innocent, was layered with subtle cues, instructions on how to react, where to place themselves in the room, how to whisper without drawing attention. Over time, the children internalized these lessons, their behavior increasingly predictable and disciplined in response to darkness. Amara observed carefully how the children responded to these lessons, cataloging their reactions, strengths, and weaknesses. Lydia, the eldest, was sharp and inquisitive, but easily startled by the smallest disruptions. Charles, logical and calculating, even at 10, absorbed lessons more methodically, obeying cues without question. Emile, barely 5, was impressionable and instinctively trusting, making him the perfect instrument for controlled fear. Each child's psychological profile became a critical element in Amara's long-term plan. She needed to mold their responses not merely for obedience, but for the eventual orchestration that would ensnare their father in the consequences of his cruelty. Outside the nursery, she maintained her vigilance of the household. Observing the master, Victor Beauregard, revealed patterns in his movements, his over-reliance on routine, and his tendency to dismiss subtle irregularities. He underestimated Amara and the intelligence of those around him, assuming silence and outward obedience equated to powerlessness. But she had learned to read body language, detect inconsistencies, and anticipate responses. Each day became a rehearsal in patience and observation, reinforcing her understanding of both human behavior and environmental control. The lessons in fear extended beyond stories. Candles were strategically dimmed at key moments, doors left slightly ajar to create anxiety, and the creaking of floorboards timed to produce tension. Each detail was subtle, leaving no trace of orchestration, yet shaping the children's instincts in preparation for the eventual convergence of the plan. The psychological conditioning was slow and deliberate. Impulsive action would have compromised the ultimate objective. By embedding these habits, Amara ensured the inevitability of future outcomes. Allies among the enslaved staff were carefully assessed and quietly recruited. Some were hesitant, fearful of repercussions, but others understood the necessity of silent complicity. A glance, a delayed response, or a minor adjustment in routine became a nonverbal language of coordination. The subtlety of this network ensured that each intervention would amplify the effectiveness of the plan without exposing any participant to risk. The household's routine, once an instrument of oppression, was gradually being transformed into a mechanism that would enforce accountability upon its master. Amara also began testing the limits of the children's obedience and comprehension. Controlled accidents in dimly lit corridors, whispered instructions about hiding, and carefully timed disturbances all served to gauge the children's responsiveness. Each experiment reinforced her confidence. Fear could be harnessed as both tool and shield. By shaping the children's perception of darkness, she created an environment in which the master's eventual entrapment would be psychologically unavoidable. Throughout this period, the master remained oblivious. Beauregard's pride, overconfidence, and habitual dismissal of Amara's subtle intelligence created an environment where patience, observation, and manipulation could flourish. Every small disruption she engineered reinforced his blind reliance on routine and predictability, laying the groundwork for a decisive and inescapable confrontation. The children, conditioned to fear, became unwitting participants in a network of controlled complicity that would culminate in the ultimate reversal of power. By nightfall, the nursery was calm, yet charged with invisible tension. The children settled into their beds, their reactions to the dim candlelight predictable and measured, a silent testament to the careful lessons they had absorbed. Amara, observing from the doorway, catalogued each response, noting how shadows, sound, and the subtleties of environment affected their behavior. The children's fear, now disciplined and controllable, was a powerful tool, shaping the future in a way that no one else, least of all their father, could anticipate. Each night, she revisited the lessons, refined the cues, and adjusted minor details in the environment. The household, the children, and the master were all part of a slowly tightening web. Patience, intelligence, and meticulous observation remained the foundation of her strategy. Every flicker of candlelight, every creak of the floor, and every shadow cast in the nursery reinforced the inevitability of what was to come. The night of judgment was still distant, but each carefully executed lesson and subtle manipulation ensured that the moment would be precise, deliberate, and unavoidable. By the 10th year of her service on the Louisiana plantation, Amara had transformed the household into a landscape she understood with intimate precision. The main house, stables, attics, cellars, and hidden passageways were catalogued in her mind with meticulous detail. Each creaking floorboard, narrow stairwell, and shadowed corner became an element of strategy, a potential tool in the orchestration of her eventual retribution. The master, Victor Beauregard, continued to underestimate her, his arrogance blind to the patient accumulation of knowledge that had been quietly taking place over a decade. The attic, a space seldom entered by the master, became a critical observation post. From there, she could monitor the hallways, the children's rooms, and even glimpses of the master's private study. She traced each structural detail, noting how light fell through windows at different hours, how sounds traveled along beams and floors, and which areas provided cover for unseen movement. These architectural insights allowed her to anticipate the movement of anyone within the estate and to plan interventions with absolute precision. Every corner of the house, every door hinge, and every overlooked opening became part of a mental blueprint for the orchestration of inevitability. The cellar, damp and largely unused, was mapped with equal care. Amara memorized the location of supporting beams, stair angles, and weak points in the floor. She envisioned how these elements could be manipulated to restrict movement or create temporary entrapment. Even minor environmental variables, the resonance of footsteps, the subtle sway of lantern light, the placement of furniture were incorporated into her mental model of the estate. In her mind, the house was no longer merely a prison but a stage for precise execution, a living mechanism through which justice could be delivered with absolute control. Amara also catalogued the routines of the master with an analytical rigor that had been honed over years. She noted the exact timing of his inspections, the predictable path he took through the house and grounds, and the patterns by which he interacted with the children and staff. His arrogance and overconfidence were instrumental to her plan. He had never suspected that obedience could conceal a mind capable of anticipating every movement, every decision, and every lapse in vigilance. By understanding these patterns, Amara transformed the household's predictability into an instrument of inevitability. The children continued to be central to her strategy. Their behavior, conditioned over years of subtle fear and disciplined response, became a predictable vector in the plan. Each whispered cue, each movement in the dark, and each reaction to environmental stimuli had been rehearsed and reinforced. Amara visualized how their fear and obedience could be leveraged in the decisive moment, guiding the master toward the trap she had constructed while ensuring the children remained instruments rather than witnesses of chaos. Allies among the enslaved staff were incorporated into this environmental and psychological mapping. A glance, a delayed response, a subtle adjustment to lighting or furniture all contributed to the orchestration of inevitability. Each ally acted without overt action, yet their participation was crucial, amplifying her influence while maintaining invisibility. By combining architectural knowledge, behavioral observation, and the silent cooperation of trusted individuals, Amara created a network in which every variable could be anticipated and manipulated. At night, she practiced mental simulations of the plan. She imagined the master's reactions, the children's movements, and the alignment of environmental variables. Each scenario was rehearsed repeatedly, with contingencies considered for every possible deviation. The attic provided the vantage point to observe both actual events and to envision hypothetical interventions. Minor anomalies in the estate, doors slightly ajar, shadows cast differently, sounds echoed unexpectedly, were incorporated into her mental rehearsals. Each rehearsal reinforced the precision, inevitability, and control that would define the execution of her retribution. The estate's corridors, stairwells, and secret passageways were now more than structural features. They were components of a strategy. Amara's understanding of spatial dynamics allowed her to anticipate movement, control attention, and manipulate perception. She considered how the master might attempt to exert control, how allies could assist subtly, and how the children could be guided through precise cues. Every aspect of the estate, from the smallest hidden corner to the broad hallways, was a variable she had studied, simulated, and integrated into her plan. Even the master's private chambers were mapped and memorized. Amara had observed his habits, when he locked doors, how he moved between rooms, how he reacted to sound or light disruptions. Each behavioral pattern was catalogued alongside architectural insights, creating a synchronized understanding of environment and psychology. The estate itself, once a prison, had become an instrument through which control could be inverted, ensuring that the culmination of years of patience, observation, and subtle manipulation would be both precise and unavoidable. By the end of each day, she returned to the nursery, checking the children's reactions to minor cues, rehearsing bedtime scenarios, and noting environmental changes. The house, the routines, the children, and the silent complicity of allies had all been integrated into a comprehensive mental map. This blueprint would serve as the foundation for the eventual confrontation, where fear, environment, and calculated orchestration would converge to deliver justice with methodical inevitability. Amara's patience and intelligence had transformed decades of subjugation into the architecture of revenge, and every detail now pointed toward the precise moment when authority would be confronted, undone, and redefined. The estate had become a living laboratory for Amara's patient orchestration of inevitability. By now, she moved through the halls with the grace of someone who could read the subtle rhythms of a household, predicting every reaction, every footstep, every whispered instruction. Each corner, stairwell, and corridor was a stage for her controlled interventions. The children, Lydia, Charles, and Emile, responded instinctively to the smallest cues, their behavior now fully integrated into the invisible mechanisms of her plan. Amara had learned that subtlety, patience, and precision were far more powerful than impulsive action. The environment, carefully manipulated, would serve as a silent accomplice. Her manipulations were minor, but deliberate. Candles were positioned slightly off-center to cast exaggerated shadows on the walls. Lanterns swayed subtly when children passed beneath them, creating the illusion of movement in empty corridors. Doors that had always closed fully were left ajar just enough to foster unease. Even the placement of objects on tables and shelves was carefully calculated. A misaligned book, a chair slightly out of place, a window shutter left unsecured, all designed to amplify the psychological tension within the household. The master, Victor Beauregard, remained unaware, interpreting these anomalies as minor annoyances rather than the orchestrated cues of a patient adversary. The children were integral to the success of these interventions. Each had internalized the lessons Amara had instilled over years of careful guidance. A whispered warning, a slight hesitation before entering a darkened hallway. A glance toward the shadows, all were responses she had cultivated to prepare them for the decisive moment. The fear she had nurtured was controlled, disciplined, and deliberate. It was not terror for its own sake, but a precise instrument that would later guide the master into the inevitability of his own entrapment. Allies among the enslaved staff participated quietly, reinforcing Amara's manipulations without drawing attention. A glance, a delayed response, or a minor adjustment in routine amplified the psychological effects of her interventions. They maintained the appearance of obedience and routine, while subtly ensuring that the environment responded in ways that aligned with Amara's long-term strategy. Each act of complicity, invisible to the master, reinforced the inevitability of the night to come. Amara also began integrating environmental cues into her manipulations. The creaking of floorboards, the whisper of the wind through shutters, the flicker of candlelight, all were incorporated into the psychological architecture of fear. She observed how each change influenced the reactions of the children and household staff, noting which cues were most effective in eliciting obedience, attentiveness, and subtle anxiety. Each observation reinforced her understanding of how environmental variables could be harnessed to control attention and behavior with precision. The master, blinded by arrogance, failed to recognize the subtle orchestration. He continued his predictable routines, confident in the loyalty and competence of those around him. Each minor disruption, each unexplained noise or shifted object, only increased his irritation and overconfidence, reinforcing the psychological leverage Amara had meticulously prepared. She understood that the key to his downfall lay in exploiting the predictable arrogance and routines that he assumed were absolute. Amara's attention to detail extended to the timing of interventions. Candles were lit or extinguished at precise moments. Doors were adjusted during predictable intervals, and shadows were manipulated to coincide with the children's movements. Every small act was rehearsed in her mind to ensure maximum psychological effect. The night of confrontation was not yet here, but every day and every evening contributed incrementally to the conditions that would make it inevitable. Her manipulations were also designed to test loyalty and resilience among her allies. By introducing minor disturbances, she observed how other enslaved workers responded, identifying those who could be trusted to act discreetly and those whose hesitation might compromise the plan. These assessments allowed her to calibrate her strategy, ensuring that each participant's role was understood and executed flawlessly when the decisive moment arrived. By the close of the day, Amara had refined her interventions to near perfection. The children's responses, the alignment of environmental cues, and the silent complicity of her allies were all synchronized to create a controlled atmosphere of anticipation and subtle tension. Every small manipulation, every calculated adjustment ensured that when the time came, the household would respond precisely as she intended, guiding the master into the psychological and physical conditions that would guarantee his entrapment. In the quiet hours of night, Amara stood by the nursery window, cataloging every reaction, every subtle disruption, and every environmental variable. The house was now a controlled instrument, its objects and inhabitants subtly aligned to execute her will. Patience, intelligence, and precision had transformed years of oppression into the architecture of inevitable justice. The master remained oblivious, yet the stage had been set. Every detail of the household, every shadow, every whispered cue, and every obedient gesture contributed to the ultimate convergence of fear and control and retribution that would define the night of reckoning. The night air hung thick with anticipation as the full moon cast its cold light over the Louisiana plantation. The estate, bathed in silvery glow, appeared tranquil, almost serene. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves filled the air, masking the silent orchestration that had been set in motion for years. Amara stood at the edge of the nursery, her eyes trained on the shadows of the hall, observing the smallest shifts in movement. Her heart, steady and composed, beat in time with the patient rhythm of the plan she had cultivated in silence. The children had been prepared, the environment primed, and the master's overconfidence had blinded him to the vulnerabilities that Amara had so carefully mapped. The evening's events would unfold like a carefully written script, with every detail accounted for. The psychological conditioning, the environmental cues, and the subtle manipulations would converge at the precise moment, trapping the master in the terror he had long imposed upon others. The master had retired to his study, a predictable habit that Amara had carefully observed over the years. He believed himself untouchable, immune to the consequences of his cruelty. His arrogance made him blind to the shifting dynamics of his household. The servants had long since learned to obey him without question, and the children had been conditioned to fear the dark. But what Beauregard did not realize was that his own actions had prepared the ground for his downfall. His reliance on routine, his dismissal of the people who served him, and his overestimation of his own invulnerability had set the stage for the inevitable. Amara's final manipulation was a whisper, a barely audible sound that slipped into the master's consciousness. It was the smallest of cues, just enough to unsettle him, to prompt him to look around, to question his surroundings. A faint creak in the floor, the subtle shift of shadows in the hallway, things he had learned to dismiss as mere coincidences. But tonight, those coincidences would become the catalyst for his undoing. The children, carefully positioned in their beds, waited for their cue. Lydia, the eldest, lay still beneath her covers, her breathing even but measured. Charles, always logical, had learned to suppress his fear, but the tension was visible in his eyes. And young Emile, still impressionable, was curled in his bed, his eyes wide as he waited for the familiar, yet unsettling, cue. The stage was set, the actors in place, and the master's fate sealed by the very fear he had cultivated in them. Amara moved through the house with deliberate care, her every step silent and calculated. She passed the study where the master sat, his silhouette barely visible through the glass door. He was absorbed in his papers, his arrogance so thick it radiated through the door. He had no idea that his isolation, his reliance on the mundane routine, had become his prison. His dependence on the familiar had blinded him to the trap that had been set for him. She approached the lantern in the hall, adjusting it ever so slightly to cast an elongated shadow across the floor. The light flickered, just for a moment, enough to make Beauregard glance up from his papers. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the hallway, but there was no real concern in his gaze, only the frustration of being disturbed by something so insignificant. The door remained slightly ajar, the very symbol of the tension she had built over the years. The children's quiet breaths filled the air, their nervous anticipation palpable. Each small sound, the soft rustling of sheets, the creak of a floorboard, the flicker of light became a prelude to the inevitable. Cato, the old stableman who had been silently complicit in Amara's plan, waited near the rear entrance, prepared to assist in the final phase of the strategy. The overseer, too, was stationed at a distance, a silent participant whose role was limited but critical to ensuring the master's final isolation. Amara positioned herself just beyond the threshold of the nursery, her eyes watching as Beauregard, still unsettled by the flickering lantern, stood from his desk and began pacing. Every step was a rehearsal for the culmination of the plan she had cultivated. The master's movements, unpredictable but methodical, became part of the choreography of his entrapment. His frustration was a form of blindness, a sign of his increasing unease as he unconsciously walked deeper into the trap she had so carefully designed. When Beauregard reached the stairs, he hesitated, as if something tugged at the edge of his consciousness. The slight flicker of light, the odd shift in sound, the subtle feeling of being watched all compounded into a growing discomfort that fed into his arrogance. He dismissed it. After all, who could threaten him in his own home? The estate, his fortress, was still intact. He was still the master. Amara's moment had arrived. With a whisper, she directed the children to obey the cues she had drilled into them for years. The fear they had internalized, now honed and controlled, was released at the perfect moment. Lydia's muffled gasp echoed in the hallway as she glanced toward the shadows, her controlled fear now palpable. Charles stiffened, his logical mind unable to suppress the unease that the darkness had planted. And Emile, his face pale, stared into the depths of the hallway, his eyes wide with a fear that had been planted long ago. In that moment, Beauregard's confidence shattered. The master, unable to reconcile the fear he felt with the authority he had so long wielded, froze. Amara, now standing in the doorway of the nursery, moved slowly, her silhouette framed by the flickering light. She had positioned herself as the final, inevitable force in the drama that had been unfolding for years. Beauregard's eyes locked onto her, his arrogance faltering for the first time. "What is this?" he muttered, a weak attempt to regain control. "What have you done?" Amara stepped forward, her gaze steady, unyielding. The children's fear, once a tool of control, now turned to terror as they witnessed their father's confusion, the very figure of authority reduced to uncertainty. It was a moment of pure inversion. The master was now the one trapped, isolated by the very fear he had instilled in others. With deliberate, calculated precision, Amara spoke. "The dark," she whispered, "is a place where the light never reaches. It is where the helpless are bound, where the powerless are left to tremble, and where the powerful learn that even they can be imprisoned." In the silence that followed, Beauregard understood. He had become the thing he had always feared, the powerless. The walls of his world, so carefully constructed, now closed in around him. His fate, once unthinkable, was now inevitable. He was trapped in the very house he had built with his arrogance, surrounded by the fear he had inflicted on others, unable to escape the consequences of his cruelty. The darkness that had once been a tool of control was now the master's prison, and Amara, patient and precise, had ensured that the night of reckoning had arrived without chaos, without violence, but with the certainty of justice. The aftermath of the night was strangely quiet, almost too calm, like the stillness after a storm that had left its mark on everything it touched. Amara remained in the shadows of the house as the dawn slowly crept over the plantation, bathing it in the cold light of a new day. The master, Victor Beauregard, was gone not physically, but psychologically. His pride, once unshakable, had crumbled like dust, carried away by the fear and helplessness Amara had so carefully orchestrated. The estate remained as it had always been, but now it was different. The invisible weight of vengeance and justice had reshaped it, leaving an imprint that would echo in every corner. The household woke, their routines unchanged, but their lives subtly altered. The master's absence, though unnoticed at first, began to leave cracks in the foundation of the estate. The children, Lydia, Charles, and Emile, continued their lessons, but they no longer looked at their governess with the same mixture of curiosity and awe. Now, they understood, perhaps in a way they had never fully grasped, the silent power Amara had wielded. The terror they had learned to fear in the darkness, now turned against the one who had been their father, had been turned into a lesson in inevitability. The servants moved through their daily chores, but there was a quiet shift in the air. The overseers and other enslaved workers no longer viewed Amara merely as a governess, but as something else, someone who had broken the invisible chains that bound them all. In their eyes, she had become more than just a servant. She was a symbol of both patience and power, a figure who had shown them that even in their powerlessness, there were moments when justice could be exacted. Amara moved through the estate, silent and composed, as she had always done, but now with an unspoken authority. She no longer had to hide the sharpness of her mind or the depth of her intelligence. The master's fall had provided her with the quiet freedom she had always sought, the freedom to exist without fear, without restraint. The house was hers, now, not in title, but in subtle, undeniable influence. The walls that had once confined her now seemed to open, offering her more power and autonomy than she had ever dared imagine. But this power came with a heavy cost. The legacy of her actions, though quiet, was far-reaching. The master's downfall, orchestrated with precision and patience, had been the culmination of years of suffering, observation, and calculated intelligence. The slaves on the estate, once subjugated and silenced, now spoke in hushed whispers of Amara's triumph. Her story, woven through the fabric of the estate's routine, became a symbol of quiet rebellion, a reminder that even in the most oppressive systems, there were moments when justice could be reclaimed, even if only for a fleeting, perfect moment. The estate, now ruled by the shadow of fear and reverence, operated in a strange, uncertain silence. The overseers were cautious in their actions, hesitant to provoke another upheaval. They had seen what could happen when cruelty was met with patience and intelligence. Amara had turned the house against its own creator, and in doing so, had rewritten the unspoken rules of power. No longer would the estate operate under the assumption of absolute control. The fear of what had happened to the master lingered like a fog, clouding the actions of anyone who dared to overstep their bounds. As for the children, they no longer feared the dark in the way they had once been taught. Their fear had been transformed, redirected toward the concept of power itself. They no longer looked at their father as an omnipotent figure. He had been reduced to something much smaller, much more vulnerable, something that could be outwitted, overthrown, and ultimately trapped. In the years that followed, they would grow into the knowledge of the terror their father had once inflicted, and in that, perhaps begin to understand the price of cruelty. Amara, now free in ways she had never dared hope for, did not revel in her victory. She did not need to gloat, nor did she seek acknowledgement. Her triumph had been quiet, deliberate, and complete. Her retribution had been exacted with precision and care, and in the silence that followed, she knew that her actions had forever altered the balance of power on the estate. She had become both a lesson and a legend, her name spoken in hushed tones among the enslaved, and later, in whispers in other plantations across Louisiana. The legacy of the dark, the fear she had planted, the terror she had fostered remained, not in the bodies of the oppressed, but in the minds of those who had once thought themselves untouchable. In the years to come, the plantation would change, new masters would come, and the enslaved workers would face new struggles. But the memory of what had happened, the quiet, methodical revenge that had undone the master, would echo through every shadow, through every corridor, every whisper in the dark. The lesson had been taught, and its impact would ripple through the generations. In the end, it was not just a master who had fallen, but the system that upheld him. Amara had proven that even in the darkest times, even in the most oppressive environments, justice could be delivered. And for the first time, the dark was no longer a place of fear. It had become the birthplace of revolution, a quiet, powerful symbol of the indomitable will to survive and resist.